and I saw several of you when I looked at the participants that joined us for this. Through primarily the month of October, we did a 5-week book club series on the color of law, which was a kind of a lead up in a lot of ways to this work, and I think a really helpful part of it for our team, thinking through the impact that the history, particularly the last 100 years of history, has had on housing policy in Atlanta and how that shapes the city today. And a lot of the work that we've done here is really based on the ideas of this book, and the book club that we did with a lot of you over the last or through the month of October, I think was a really helpful exercise. And I think I hope that this builds on that work and continues kind of into the what's next question coming that a lot of us had coming out of that book club. So we've got some interactive elements of this, and this is the first one that we have today that I want to kind of walk you through, I guess, on the front end. And Sonia, if I butcher this, please come and help me. But if you use the website here at the very top of the page and the code that's listed there, you'll have access to it. I encourage you to, I'll give you a second right now actually to get it pulled up, because we have a handful of these all throughout the presentation that I'd love for you to be able to engage in. So as you answer the questions, it'll pull up live here, and we'll see what you think about different things that we're talking through. Got a lot of book plug folks on. This is great. Glad y'all made it on tonight. All right, just another second. I feel like I'm like waiting for popcorn at like by the microwave to figure out how many times it needs to stop popping before I move on. It's like on a lot of people's reading lists. So I hope that after tonight's presentation and your engagement on Atlanta City Design Housing, you'll be inspired to read the book. I think it's a really, I think it's an important book about the role that housing policy has played in discrimination and the shaping of the country. And there's a lot of stuff in there that I think is important to think about in Atlanta and where we are today. So cool. Thanks for engaging on that, everyone. So the history of this, and Tim mentioned it a little bit to kick it off, but the work that we did that really came to this point with Atlanta City Design Housing kind of has two origins. One, in 2019, the mayor released the One Atlanta Housing Action Plan that lays out, I think it's 45 actions around housing affordability in the city, and a lot of the actions in that housing action plan are zoning, land use, and design related actions. And so, that kind of mixed with the vision of Atlanta City Design and the work that was done there, and we'll get into a lot of elements of Atlanta City Design through the presentation, are really thinking critically about the city that Atlanta is and how to help Atlanta become the best version of itself, and in a nuanced way that understands kind of the history and the character of neighborhoods and really thinks critically about that. We think that kind of the merging of those two worlds together of seeking deep housing affordability, but in a way that makes sense in Atlanta, in a way that really treats design as an important element of the city's future. Really is what those two things together brought us to where we are with this project in Atlanta City Design Housing. So here's our next test, our quiz question. How many residents does the city of Atlanta currently have on most recent census estimates? All right, it seems like most folks know. Atlanta recently, just this last year, broke 500,000 residents for the first time in the city's history. And this occurred after several decades of the city's history, from the late 60s up until the early 2000s, where we had static and even population decline in the city for quite a long time. But coming out of the housing crash and the recession, the city's seen the largest population increase that we've seen in at least a generation. And we expect that to only continue growing. And in the next generation, we expect that the population of the city will increase more than double what we are today, to somewhere around 1.2 million people as we continue to grow and the region continues to grow. So I'm gonna come back to this slide real quick, and I'm gonna show you this picture. Well, actually, we'll start here. What percentage do you think of the city's land use is currently zoned exclusively for single-family housing? Well, we're pretty even across the board on this one. Right answer is 60%. Around 60% of the city's land use is currently zoned exclusively for single-family housing. Here's a current map of the city's exclusively single-family zoned areas. All right, another question. So now that you know that, and you know the city's population, what do you think is, Atlanta is the blank most densely populated city in the United States. What number do you think? All right, we are all over the place on this one. But I don't know if this is the top answer at this point, but it's close to the top. 3/16 is the right answer. That today, Atlanta is the 316th most densely populated city in the United States, with a population per square mile of around 3,500 residents. And you can take a look at all of the cities behind here that are currently more densely populated in the city of Atlanta is like Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And with a city that's seeing significant population growth and low population density and restrictive land use, particularly with such a large percentage of the city exclusively for single-family housing, what we're creating in many ways is an inelastic housing supply market. The housing supply in a city that has the ability to kind of grow and accommodate housing supply at the pace of demand can keep the cost of housing lower over time, and it kind of gradually moves up. But in a situation where you have restrictive land use, the inability to build enough housing supply and housing options in a place, then the demand goes up, and you have a housing supply shortage, so the cost goes up faster than it should. It also creates a scenario oftentimes where those with the most financial agency get to choose where they want to live first, and then everyone else has to kind of respond to that. And so it creates a situation where lower income residents, and particularly lower income legacy residents, have less options in a shorter amount of time for housing in their neighborhoods when the housing market is in an inelastic supply situation. And in just the last decade, the city has seen a 50% increase in our median home sale price, from around $196,000 to nearly $300,000. So this is really like indicator for us of the inelasticity of the housing market and how fast the home sale prices risen in the city. So we wanted to stop and ask the question, how did we get here? Were we always the 316th most densely populated city in the United States? We always have a housing supply problem, an inelastic housing supply market. Were we always 60% exclusionary zoned for single family housing? The first thing we learned when we started looking through that is that in 1940, the city of Atlanta had a population density nearly 2.5 times what we have today, or well over 2 times, I guess, what we have today, at 8,500 people per square mile, where today is only about 3,500 people per square mile. So we were a much more dense city in 1940, this kind of white area that you see here, than we were in 2018. So why did that happen, and what can we learn from that? Well, the first question is, what role does zoning play in that? When do you think that the city of Atlanta first zoning ordinance was adopted? All right, I got the right answer. It's 1929. And this is the 1929 zoning code for the city of Atlanta. I think two things there's a few things interesting, but the first thing to note, I would say, is that this is the first time the zoning was used in the city. Much of the city's in-town neighborhoods had developed in many ways prior to 1929. So a lot of the built environment existed prior to then, and this zoning amendment catered around that and allowed for a certain level of flexibility within it. For instance, the yellowish orange color here, called dwelling houses, it allowed 2 units by right and then accessory dwelling units as well. And this modeled after the city's duplexes and single family homes that were next to one another in many of these neighborhoods, and allowed enough flexibility for those to coexist. And that's why you still see a lot of historic duplexes in this part of the city. The other thing that's important to note about the 1929 zoning code is this is the first time that the city uses zoning to begin creating economic exclusion. The red areas here are apartment zones, and they were separated out from the dwelling house areas. And this was done in many ways to say these areas are we don't want residents that live in apartments to live next to us. And so there starts kind of this movement to say the type of housing, the housing option that you have is indicative of a certain kind of social class, economic class, racial class that we do not want to be a part of. And we want to not be in our neighborhood. And then zoning begins to be used starting in 1929, and then it builds from there as a means of economic exclusion, and also later a means of really building on that, a means of racial exclusion to segregate the city intentionally through land use and zoning decisions. And then building on that, starting in the 1930s, under the New Deal, under the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and also in partnership really with the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, the federal government begins doing what is commonly called now redlining. And redlining builds on the zoning for economic exclusion that was done through the zoning code, and uses federally backed mortgages to reinforce racial exclusion through zoning. And this is really where you see single family zoning begin to take place. And if you get a chance to look at the story map, this is embedded, and you can actually get in and play around and see the original notations that were done on each of these areas of the city. But two things happen when this is done. There's a reinforcing through the federal government. The single family zoning is good and density is bad. So it kind of reinforces this idea that we're kind of a move away from density. So this is a critical step in the move away from density for the city. But it also reinforces racially restricted covenants, and the FHA stops giving any kind of federal backing, or doesn't give any federal, it doesn't stop, it never did, I guess, but does not give any support in many of the Black and brown and immigrant communities in the city's core, and really modeled in a lot of ways over the apartment districts on the image I just showed you. And so funding is cut off from lots of communities and disinvested in intentionally, both at the local level and then also at the federal level, while single-family neighborhoods are supported both through the zoning code and then also through federal-backed mortgages. And what that creates in many ways is diverging paths in the city. On the one hand, the redlined areas that are completely cut off from funding and denied any kind of access to resources end up in really bad situations because they don't have access to the basic economy of a city. We did some initial analysis on this. In 1938 is when the HLSC's redlining maps were finalized, or the most recent ones that we have are. And so 82 years later, all of the grade areas that you see here either no longer exist or are still predominantly low to moderate income neighborhoods today. And you can see how many of them intersect with freeways. And if you look at the story map, you can see kind of step by step where all this happens. But these neighborhoods then really pave the way for urban renewal and the destruction of neighborhoods. And so we have such a large percentage of the city's of these redlined areas that never recovered from decisions that were made 100 years ago at this point. And that redlining decision paved the way for urban renewal that came in the 50s and 60s. And seen here, this is, I'll go back here for just a second. We're looking at kind of just this area right through here that's grayed out there. You got two freeways that come in and a stadium project that really follows the model where the redlining is. And so this kind of sets the stage of where you gut out so much of the urban core, the dense city grids, and the apartment buildings that did exist in the city and are kind of rooted out systematically over time. And at the same time, single-family homes are reinforced, they're preserved, they're kept, and so you end up with a city that's primarily this and has lost many of its other apartments and other housing options. So all of that considered and where we are today, where do you think Atlanta ranks as in its highest income inequality among other U.S. cities? All right, you're right about that. Unfortunately, Atlanta is #1 on that list as the city with the worst income inequality in the U.S. And this has been a pattern over a number of years, and in many ways as a result of these decades of federal and local decisions of segregating the city across race and class. One other thing that we found really interesting in looking through this and thinking about the single-family map is the role that single-family has played in racial isolation in the city. The most racially segregated areas in the city are also the areas that are single-family zoned, and the areas that have the most diversity of housing options and allow the most diversity of housing options are also the most integrated communities in the city as well. And all of that kind of really combines to a city that is still in many ways kind of shaped by its past, and the city breaks across race and class lines very starkly, and the decisions that were made to racially exclude residents from the city, from certain areas of the city, from certain neighborhoods, has had lasting impact on the median household income of neighborhoods, on the education level, and notably on the home price per square foot, which is indicative of the opportunity to create wealth and have opportunity. The being cut out of the home, the ability to own a home for decades prior to the Fair Housing Act, and that those repercussions still have lasting impact today. So where do we go from here? What what do we do to address these very structural issues that the city has today? First, I think to come back to Atlanta city design, city design lays out two distinct areas of the city and typologies of the city, and that we think are important for thinking about the future of Atlanta and how we grow and how do we grow correctly or grow in a way that really fits within the character of the city. Growth areas are areas of the city, both you include the urban core and then corridors and particular clusters like Buckhead and Greenbrier Mall area. These are areas of the city that are most conducive to high growth. They're aligned near transit. And so as the city grows, growing in these areas are the places of the city where we should focus our highest growth because they're likely closest to transit access and job centers and education and fresh food access and really kind of the heartbeat of the city. But you'll notice also that the way that growth areas kind of meander through the city, they connect also with these larger swaths of more residential areas. And these areas in Atlanta city design we call conservation areas. And these are areas that are lower density areas primarily than your growth areas. And this is where a lot of Atlanta residents currently live. You'll notice that a lot of this is the existing single family, looks a lot like the single family map that we just looked at. These are areas where a lot of the city's tree canopy and nature exists. But for a very long time now, this area of the city in many ways hasn't been able to contribute to new housing supply and has not been a part of the growth of the city. And as we looked through this and thought critically about what does growth look like to go from a city of right around 500,000 to 1.2 million, what does subtle, gentle growth look like, and how do we think kind of within the character of the conservation areas, how do we grow in a way that continues to honor that character and protect that character, but also allows this area of the city to contribute to the growth of Atlanta. So two main areas kind of policy proposals that we're working through that we'll go. The first gets back to what Tim mentioned early on, is the idea that we want to stimulate the development of naturally occurring affordable housing options. So the first thing is to end the exclusionary practice of single-family zoning and allow an additional dwelling unit citywide. And by this, really, I mean, the reason that we're really specific with the term exclusionary when talking about single-family housing is that the zoning category was designed to make sure that housing options that were more affordable did not exist in certain neighborhoods. This was intentionally done for economic exclusion in these neighborhoods. It outlawed things like basement apartments and other types of more affordable housing options. And so we think that allowing options like this can both be beneficial for property owners, a homeowner who has a house and would like to earn additional revenue by converting their garage into an apartment. But it's also subtle, right? Like it doesn't change the shape and feel of a neighborhood. And it also has value in that it provides a more affordable housing option. It's cheaper than the single family house that it operates in generally, and it allows someone at a different income level to now have access to a neighborhood that otherwise would have been out of reach for them financially. So I'll run through a couple of different kind of scenarios that we're looking at. This is what we're calling an over-under additional unit. So you've got your kind of primary unit here, and then you've got an additional stairwell up to another unit that was on the second floor in this situation. Here's a recessed second unit. So, you've got your primary unit here. These are attached, but this one's set back a little bit further. This is a newer development here. And then you have your more traditional basement apartment like this. And I think this one's in Grant Park. So you got your primary entrance here. This is on a corner. And so the side entrance here into a basement apartment unit here. So we think that units like this throughout the city could play a valuable role in unlocking that 60% of the city, the single family zone right now, and creating a more affordable housing option naturally and not through subsidy. So how many new housing units do you think can be created if 15% of the existing single family properties add an additional unit? All right, well, let's call it there. So 11,500 units is the correct answer. So y'all got that one right too. So we estimate that well over 10,000 or over 11,000 units could be created if 15% of current single-family properties added an additional unit like the one we're talking about. Another thing that we'd love to expand the use of and flexibility around how exactly these work and how they can create an affordable option is the accessory dwelling unit. So the city, in the last couple of years passed an accessory dwelling unit ordinance that allowed these separate structures. And so if you're not familiar with accessory dwelling units, they're, think tiny house. They're a little bit larger than tiny houses, but they're up to 750 square feet and can be built in a backyard in certain single family areas of the city, and right now can be rented out. And so we've seen some development of these and would love to see more in more places of the city because it's still limited in certain areas. And so a couple ideas around how to make that work better. The first one for us is to allow ADUs to be sold separately from primary dwelling units. So under the current structure, ADUs can only be done, only be rented out. But there's currently for the areas of the city that do allow duplexes, there's something called a fee simple subdivision that allows two sides of a duplex to be sold separately from one another. The benefit of that is that now you can have 2 units for sale instead of 1, and it allows it in a for sale way. And the 2 separate units tend to be more affordable than a single unit would have been prior to that. That same allowance that you can do for a duplex, you currently can't do for a single family house in an ADU, even though it's the same number of units on lot. So this proposal would be to allow kind of a lot, and we call it flag lots because it looks similar to a flag with a pole here and the flag up this way, but would allow the similar type of subdivision so that homeowners could then get a more traditional mortgage for this, because it's financing has proven difficult under the current model. This would allow financing to be a little bit easier. And then we also believe it would create a whole new element of affordable for sale products. So, purchasing an accessory dwelling unit in a backyard is likely less costly than purchasing a primary single family house on the front lot. And so by creating this, we think it can make more affordable for sale options in neighborhoods that otherwise may be unaffordable. The other thing with ADUs, as I mentioned, the kind of light pink areas are areas where they are allowed currently. And so we're proposing that we expand it to more areas of the city than that and allow this type of development pattern in all of the existing single family areas of the city. The next thing that we're proposing to do is really to go back in and expand the way that we allow small apartment buildings in the city. These small apartment buildings are, many of you may have seen them in your neighborhoods. A lot of them existed prior to 1929. And even then some after that, some were allowed in the apartment building sections of that. A lot of these were destroyed over the decades of urban renewal and otherwise in the city, but some still exist. And they are typically kind of, your 4, 6, 8, 10 unit apartment buildings in near commercial corridors and in neighborhoods. And we think these are particularly helpful to consider near the city's high capacity transit stations. And so starting with your MARTA heavy rail, and then I think potentially, could expand beyond that. But I think this is the first area that they're, within a half mile of MARTA station, there are a lot of areas of that in the city that are zoned much lower density than these small apartment buildings. And these are areas of the city that are, make the most sense for higher density growth in many ways, because they would align our new growth in our heavy rail transit. So it would take pressure off of our car infrastructure in the city as we grow. And it also would allow us to lower the cost of living in this particular apartment building, because if you don't have to have the cost of owning a car, it can make your cost of living go down. And so we think starting here would be a great way to expand kind of the by right allowance of these small apartment buildings in the city, and would also help us to grow in a way that is more conducive to sustained growth, because single family development pattern is difficult for growth in a city. The next thing that we want to do is to remove parking minimums that exist in the city. If you're not familiar with parking minimums, they are an element in the zoning code that requires a particular development, residential development, commercial development, et cetera, to have X number of parking spots based on the number of units, number of bedrooms, amount of square foot that a particular project has. And this can be quite costly particularly for large multifamily. A parking spot in a structured deck in an apartment building can cost as much as $40,000 per parking spot. And estimates on that say, that gets relayed eventually onto the renter or the condo owner, if it's a structured lot like that, to the tune of somewhere around $125 a month. So the added cost of parking really makes it a less affordable place to live. And it also reinforces our car dependency. And so as the city grows and becomes less car dependent, and we desire to have affordability, that these parking minimums can pose an issue toward that. We also think in the city design growth areas, after analysis that we've done on this, we realized that there are a lot of areas of that are low density residential zoned areas. A lot of these are single family zoned that are in areas of the city that make the most sense for high growth. So we think taking a closer look at these and figuring out where we can proactively upzone these areas so that we can make sure to conserve the conservation areas will be an important part of the city's growth. And then the last part of stimulating the naturally occurring market is really to invest in housing innovation. And we've done some initial work over the last year and hope to expand this in the coming year in leading in housing innovation and new housing types in the city. So to take the small apartment buildings near transit options, we're thinking about this. These are two, I think they were prior to this, they were vacant lots in a single family duplex in the area. This is two areas right here. You got 4 units in this building, 4 units in this building, and 1 unit back here. So you have 9 units now that you're able to do, but they're done in a way that's conducive to the neighborhood character and at the same time allows for lots of new units that are all relatively affordable units to come into existence. So the other section that we'll go through quickly here, so that we can stop and do some Q&A, is the idea of increasing development of dedicated affordable housing citywide. And this is the subsidized conversation we're talking about, and what does that look like, and how do we continue to move that forward? The first thing for us is using publicly owned vacant land for affordable housing, and leveraging land that the city owns and other public agencies own as the dirt itself as an asset to leverage that to create long-term affordable housing in these areas. Some of them, like this one here in South Downtown, actually across the street from City Hall, are in high growth areas that would create a lot of opportunity for access to amenities and job access that could be really helpful. And then others are in conservation areas where it may make the most sense to build, a home with an ADU in the backyard to move those forward. But I think kind of across the board, how the city leveraging this as an asset to create more affordable housing options on our publicly owned vacant land. Also, for us, increasing the way we use, so inclusionary zoning has been a tool the city has used around the Atlanta Beltline to ensure that all new development includes at least some amount of affordability. Right now, it ranges between 10 and 15%, depending on the type of affordability that a developer provides. And that's in all new development that happens with the Beltline for apartment development. So we're proposing that near the West Side Quarry Park in the Grove Park neighborhood, that we create a new affordability district similar to that would ensure that long-term new development that happens related to the park because of the city's investment and the public investment in a new park, that new development includes some element of affordability. The next thing that we want to do is to think about how the city grows equitably and how do we ensure that our subsidized affordability is distributed across the city more evenly, but also in a way that honors the city's growth areas and the kind of growth pattern of the city. And so in order to do that, we looked at the 9 high school clusters in the city, and aligned that both with the city design growth areas in order to weight that so that that we're paying more focus on those that have high growth areas. And so when you look at that, the breakdown ends up being kind of something like this, where you see that that there's a varying amount of kind of focus on here. But our goal with this is that we align all of our housing subsidy programs. So the different incentives, whether it's tax abatement or otherwise, that we add a geographic component to it, so that it focuses on growth areas, and it also focuses on distributing it across the city, so that we're not concentrating them in one area of the city. Because if you're familiar with kind of subsidized affordable housing world, you'll know that a lot of times subsidized affordable housing is often built in lower income neighborhoods that reinforces kind of a concentration of lower income residents, and really reinforces the economic segregation that we talked about. And so creating goals like this and building our incentives in ways that really reinforce our desire to see them more equitably distributed across the city, we think will be an important next step in that. And one program particularly that we think we can potentially move this forward on is the Urban Enterprise Zone program. It's a tax abatement program from the 1980s that we are currently working to and hope to in 2021 introduce state legislation that will allow us to do this, that will allow us flexibility on where we can give this tax abatement out in order to create dedicated affordable housing. Right now, the only area of the city that you can build, that you can use this tax abatement tool, is the dark purple areas here. And so by giving us flexibility and updating this program, we can really use this tool to get affordable housing options in growth areas, in higher cost areas that otherwise would not likely naturally occur. We also think that focusing on growth areas is really important, because these are areas that are going to give the best transit access without a car, best access to jobs, education, other opportunities like that are important for quality of life. So those are our main ideas. And the last thought I'll leave you all with is a Jane Jacobs quote that we've talked a lot about with this project, is the cities have the capacity to provide something for everybody only because and only when they are created for everybody. And that's really, in a lot of ways, I think encapsulates our goal here, that we think critically about the design of the city and how it works as we think through this. So that's Atlanta City Design Housing. And I will stop there. And actually, I'll do one last slide here. We have if you have questions that we can't get to tonight and you want to do it, we have a email address here. And actually, I'll leave this up while we start talking. housing@atlantagA.gov. Please email us and we'll get back to you with any questions that you have.
Thank you, Josh. And I'm going to ask Sonia, have you got questions kind of queued up for us? Is that how we're going to do this?
Yes, we do. And Carolina, I think you can take it away with those.
Okay.
Great. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for your questions. The first question is, what are the barriers to implementing the policies that the Atlanta City Design Housing is recommending?
Well, I think the barriers are us, really. Us as residents of the city, just, getting comfortable or familiar with and shaping these recommendations such that they're ones that we support and can successfully introduce to City Council for approval, because each one of these items does require legislation. And our expectation was to begin going to City Council early next year with each of these. We actually have one that's in process now, which is the one that Josh spoke to towards the end about expanding the requirement for some affordability around the west side, Quarry Park. That one is in process right now. But the others we would be expecting to bring early next year. And I think the question is a very good one, because this isn't, what Josh was describing was not something that, the point of this was to create a series of proposals that seem to be commensurate with the characteristics of this particular city. We were not trying to say, let's build dense, tall, apartments everywhere. No, that's not what this is suggesting. This is saying, hey, we are a city of residential neighborhoods, and let's find ways where we can add some more diversity of units within those neighborhoods to achieve some affordability. When you think about it, if only 15% of those properties in the city added an additional unit, you're achieving 11,500 new units in the city. I mean, an incredible amount of smaller scale, more affordable units. And then, stick to the growth areas when it comes to denser things because of all the services we have there. So what we wanted this to kick off is, including tonight, is a conversation for us as a community around how we do something that almost no city has done, which is maintain affordability, diversity as the city grows. Josh mentioned it. The region is projected to grow by nearly 3 million people over the next 30 years. And Atlanta will be growing at the same time. And if we lose this naturally occurring affordable housing, we will have lost something that is so central to Atlanta. But we want to do it in ways that are, as I said, commensurate with the city we have. So I think the biggest barrier is us getting around and not trying to say one group is better than another or one area is better than another. And let's acknowledge the qualities of this city that make it what it is, and work together on getting consensus that we can take to city council for approval of legislation. Long answer, sorry.
Thank you, Tim. The next question is how will historic preservation tie in with affordable housing?
Well, I mean, we think preservation is central to affordability in every way. I mean, we've got currently, as some of you probably know, 19 historic districts in the city. We have recently been creating historic districts with neighborhoods like Ponce Highland recently, for the very purpose of protecting existing old buildings such that they can continue to provide affordability, but also in the Ponce Highland case, and also there between Ponce and North Avenue nearby, the districts we created, and actually this goes for Mean Street as well, we created a district that was about preserving the historic structures, but giving you more flexibility with regard to new construction. So I think, there's hesitation about historic districts sometimes because people feel they're so, they're tough in terms of new construction. So these new districts we've been doing are more forgiving when it comes to new construction, but really concentrating on preservation of old structures for the very reason that those old structures often are the ones that if we save them and we build around them, can provide affordability.
The other thing I'll add on that, Tim, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about many of these housing types that we're talking about tonight exist in the historic district of the city. They're the small apartment buildings, the duplexes, and the basement apartments. Like these are historic properties that are historically part of the city's design pattern, and I think preserving them and preserving these older buildings are an important part of any equation toward having a diversity of affordable housing options in the city.
Super. One of the hot topics in our chat and the Q&A has to do with ADUs. So just a lot of questions about the ADUs, the different opportunities for them. How do we fund them? How do we make them possible? But also concerns. And so can you talk a little bit more about accessory dwelling units?
Well, one thing I'll say, and Josh might want to speak to the discussions we've had around how we could help with ADUs, and thinking about that even financially or ways that the public can help sometimes with these things. But one thing we learned with the ADU ordinance that was adopted recently is we adopted it, but it still is hard for people to build ADUs. I mean, some of it is just the regulations themselves aren't properly written, and we feel like we need to revisit those, you know, such that they're enabling ADUs in as simple a way as possible. Some of it has to do with just the challenge of you know, some people financing a second building on their property and all those kinds of things. So what we wanted to do was go back and revisit the regulations that we had done and see how we can make them work better, so we can make it not so hard for people to build ADUs. But importantly, this issue of an additional unit, such that you don't have to build a separate building on your property, and perhaps you could build a second unit, as Josh went through those examples, in your basement or attach it to your house, you know, just to give some more flexibility to people to add that accessory second unit, and maybe sometimes it wouldn't be an ADU. So that's one aspect of it. But Josh, we've been talking about other things as it relates to how to do better on ADUs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, there's some like logistics, like, you know, how it works with the setbacks and some other things that I think we're working through as far as, you know, to your point on the first ordinance, and just trying to, you know, as we've learned more, as people are building them, want to be responsive to that and make sure that you know, the code's written in a way that actually works for folks who are trying to build them. The biggest challenge that really for us that we wanted to address, that we realized has been a gap, and Tim alluded to it, is the financing of the ADU, how to pay for it. And so I think the two elements of that, and one is the additional dwelling unit, which is it's not necessarily an ADU as a separate structure, but it allows more flexibility for homeowners and allows them to potentially build something out of the primary structure they already have, which is often more affordable than building a brand new separate structure. And the other thing that we think could be really helpful on the financing side of it is the flag lot idea, that a proposal that we put out that would allow that to be financed in a way that would be more like a traditional home would be financed, and could allow homeowners who otherwise may not be able to afford or get a loan under ADUs in the current structure to have access to it. So we think that access could be really helpful, and to just make them more available and easier to build, easier to buy, and to give both a rental and a for sale option for it, I think could make them work and be more diverse options available to more homeowners than they are today.
Okay, thank you. And I think for our last question, we'll throw this one out there. As we focus on affordable housing, how do we tie encouraging development for resources that citizens need, like grocery stores, schools, childcare, healthcare facilities, first and last mile of transportation, post office, and more?
Well, I mean, you know, the really the topic tonight, of course, is the housing aspect of things, and you know, each one of those things that you listed is a whole discussion unto itself. None of them are, you know, it's not like one group. Every piece of this has its own constraints or circumstances that the city has to move towards. But I think, you know, a lot of it, honestly, the shape of the city and the fact that the city grows in a way where services like that are available to everyone, but in a way that you know, the city basically just accentuates itself as it grows, is very much a part of Atlanta city design. You know, I mean, the broader picture of how do we grow as a healthy city in all respects is part of Atlanta city design. Atlanta city design housing is really just trying to narrow in on this housing issue, which is so fundamentally important to every city, but the diversity of housing and the ability to house so many different people in Atlanta is so important to Atlantans, which is why we're just focused on this right now. Probably not a very satisfying answer, but I think the bigger issue of growing the city more holistically is very much a part of Atlanta city design. So I encourage everybody to look at that.
Yeah, two things I'd add. I mean, one, we are working on the update to the comprehensive development plan that gets at some of the questions around kind of how you know, our zoning plays a role in that, and then obviously, and we're also starting a process for the full zoning rewrite. So I think there's, you know, conversation about the you know, the way in which the separation of uses has played a role in that. I think it is an important part. But the other thing I'll say that ties really more into the housing conversation is the city of Atlanta is 316th in population density compared to U.S. cities, and particularly in areas of the city that are single-family zoned, we're much lower density than that. And very low density cities or very low density areas don't have enough population density to provide a lot of those resources. And in a lot of ways, our zoning for low density has created a scenario where it's a lot harder to have those resources in close enough proximity to residents. So addressing the housing related issues that we're talking about here actually has a very indirect, or maybe even a more direct, it's not indirect, it's direct consequence in making these more viable and making it a lot easier for these kind of resources to be close to where residents live. And so I think that I know that's not necessarily one of the topics that we're talking about tonight, but I do think it's connected. And I think that making, addressing the city and kind of these types of policies will contribute to making that an easier question to answer in the future.
I know we have to wrap up. This is just the first of what will be many discussions, as you can imagine, on this topic. We'll be at the NPUs in January, and there'll be lots of chances for us to discuss this in greater detail and much deeper detail, much deeper. I'll just say that. What I wanted to say to close, though, is that, sometimes I think when we have discussions about growth and development, the discussion sounds as though we have a choice between something and nothing. And honestly, we don't. I mean, just to be clear about that, it's a choice between something and something else, because, the city's changing and growing and things. We're not, the growth projections that we make for the city are built off of the Atlanta Regional Commission's projections about the region. We're not talking about a static place here. We're talking about a place that is going to be changing dynamically in the coming years and a few decades. And so I hope you'll look at this through that lens of, in the context of that, how can we grow? How can Atlanta grow like it hasn't ever before, but in ways that don't just make this a completely different place, that really you recognize as Atlanta? That's what this is about. So please, as you get prepared for the deep discussions and differences of opinion we'll have as we continue this discussion, please take that into consideration. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you for joining us tonight. Hope everybody has a great holiday season, and we'll talk a lot more about this in the new year.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Tim. Y'all have a great night.